An ordinary billionaire can get by with a business jet. Here, the scale is entirely different. One of the most discussed aircraft in the Russian presidential air fleet is the Il-96-300 PU, a special version of the long-range aircraft where PU is usually decoded as command post. In the press, this aircraft has repeatedly been called a flying Kremlin, and here the nickname sounds absolutely deserved. According to open publications, this is not just an airplane for flights, but a full-fledged airborne office, in which one can fly halfway across the world without falling out of the rhythm of power for even a single minute. The basic Il-96 is already a serious machine, a wide-body, four-engine airliner created for long routes, but the presidential version is on another level. In the media and in specialized publications, the cost of such an aircraft, together with deep modification, special communications, protected systems, and the interior, was estimated at up to hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is exactly the kind of case where price stops being just a number, because here, it is not only the metal that is being paid for. Here, what is being paid for is the ability to lift into the sky an almost autonomous residence. According to descriptions in the press, everything inside looks exactly the way the airplane of a person of this level should look. Separate rooms for rest, a work area, a space for meetings, an interior with expensive finishes, massive furniture, calm classical aesthetics that work not for flamboyance, but for status. In such a machine, people do not simply fly. In it, they continue to live at their usual scale. And that is why this aircraft is perceived not as luxurious transport, but as a state level of comfort raised to an altitude of 10 kilometers. And the most interesting thing here is not even the gold, not the finish, and not the size of the cabin. The most interesting thing is the logic. When an ordinary private jet is bought for convenience and speed, such an aircraft exists for three things at once: comfort, protection, and complete control.
Luxury life.
4 aircraft and a sky without accidents. For a long time, one very revealing detail has circulated around presidential aviation. Even when the public's attention is fixed on one aircraft, the movement scheme itself always remains in the shadows. And it is precisely this that reveals the real scale. For people of this level, it is not just the airplane that matters. What matters is an entire logistics system in which literally everything has been calculated in advance. Backup options, reserve, closed communications, security, route, landing point, escort. That is why the conversation about presidential flights is almost never limited to a single machine. The Il-96-300 PU is the tip of the visible part of the iceberg. But around it, there is always an infrastructure in which luxury ceases to be only an interior and begins to be measured by reliability. Because when one flight costs like the budget of a small production facility, and one aircraft by itself is worth tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars, one has to pay not only for beauty, but also for the absence of accidents. Against this background, helicopters look especially interesting. The airplane is powerful, impressive, and full of status, but it is the helicopter that shows how expensive real mobility is. Where the airliner needs a runway, the helicopter needs only a landing pad. Where the motorcade runs into the limits of the road, the helicopter simply lifts into the air. In the Russian state air fleet, for many years, the aircraft of the Mi-8 family played an important role, working, reliable, universal, but in the necessary configuration, capable of being both transport and an instrument of rapid movement along a closed route. This is no longer about a beautiful picture. This is about turning the entire map of the country into a personal network of access points. Aurus Senate, a limousine that is supposed to look like power. If in the sky the role of symbol is played by the Il-96-300 PU, then on the ground all attention is taken by the Aurus Senate. And it must be admitted, for the camera, it is the perfect car. It does not look like a billionaire's toy. It does not try to be sporty or aggressive. It looks exactly the way an official limousine should look. Long, heavy, expensive, calm, and so monumental that it feels as though it was designed not by designers but by architects. When Reuters wrote about the launch of production of the civilian Senate, the base price of the car was named at the level of 18 million rubles. At that moment, that was approximately $245,000. And that is only the civilian version, without all the equipment that distinguishes a state car from a production model. Already at this stage, it becomes clear. Aurus is not just an expensive sedan. It is a car that was originally created as something status-driven, exclusive, and demonstratively not for the mass market. But the main thing here begins where the open price list ends, because the presidential limousine is a completely different conversation. This is armor, reinforced components, special systems, another level of communication, another level of protection, and a completely different task. The car must not only look beautiful on camera, it must be quiet, comfortable, imposing, and at the same time work like a fortress on wheels. That is exactly why Aurus fits so well into the aesthetics of luxurious power. There is no fuss in it, no demonstrative aggression, no attempt to shout about its price. It produces a more expensive effect, the effect of absolute confidence. Imagine how the very perception of the road changes when your everyday car is not just a luxury class sedan, but a mobile cabin of state scale. When the wide door opens, not like that of an ordinary car, but like that of a machine in which a sense of importance has been built in from the start. And yes, it is precisely on details like these that an expensive image is built. A price of When the wide door opens, not like that of an ordinary car, but like that of a machine in which a sense of importance has been built in from the start. And yes, it is precisely on details like these that an expensive image is built. A price of 18 million rubles for a production car is already impressive, but in the case of the presidential version, the number on the price tag stops being the main thing. A garage where status and nostalgia stand side by side. The most curious thing in the automotive part of this story is the contrast, because next to the Aurus, which looks like an official manifesto on 4 wheels, completely different cars regularly surface in the public space, and it is precisely they that make the picture more dimensional. One of the most famous cars associated with the early personal story is the Zaz 968. By the standards of a channel about luxury, this sounds almost paradoxical. Against the background of limousines, super yachts, and special aircraft, there suddenly appears a car that many remember as a symbol of a completely different era. But that is exactly where the strength of the detail lies, because sometimes what is expensive is not the object itself, but its biography. A car may cost relatively modestly, but at the same time be priceless as a personal artifact. Further along this chain appears the Gaz 21, a car that even today looks cinematic. This is no longer just retro, this is true Soviet classicism, a car with character, with the right silhouette, with that very heavy bodywork plasticity that instantly returns you to the era of broad avenues, long coats, and old-school state motorcades. Against the background of the modern Aurus, such a car works like a beautifully staged pause. A reminder that the taste for symbols of power and metal with character did not appear yesterday. Then comes the Lada Niva, and here a different type of luxury begins. Not ceremonial, but almost utilitarian. The Niva was never a car for the red carpet. It is loved for its off-road ability, its simplicity, and that very feeling that it will get through where more expensive machinery will stop to think. And that is exactly why its appearance in such a list looks unexpectedly powerful. There is also a foreign accent in this collection, the Mercedes ML. According to media reports, the price of such cars in the corresponding period could have been at the level of tens of thousands of dollars, and in the context of this collection, that looks especially curious. Because against the background of ultra-expensive special versions and state vehicles, German premium here already looks almost restrained. Later, Lada Vesta also appeared in public episodes, already as a modern mass-market Russian sedan.
Отличная машина, очень хорошая. Приемистая, легкое в управлении.
Это не машина, это какая-то лопата, это грабли.
This contrast works almost perfectly. On one side, an aircraft worth hundreds of millions, a limousine, armor, yachts, motorcades. On the other, a car that thousands of ordinary people see. Luxury here does not look monochrome. It does not consist of one unbroken line of equally expensive toys. It is assembled from symbols. Somewhere the symbol becomes price, somewhere status, somewhere memory, and somewhere the very ability to move effortlessly from a historic Soviet legend into a limousine that costs as much as a collection of elite real estate. Graceful, a yacht that looks like a floating palace. If we move to the water, then here everything begins to get truly beautiful. One of the most famous yachts associated with this story was Graceful. later also appearing under the name Kosatka. According to Forbes, its value was estimated at approximately $119 million, its length at about 267 feet, and that is already the territory not simply of expensive boats, but of true super yachts. $119 million is the kind of price tag that stops being perceived as the cost of transport. It is already the price of a separate floating world. And judging by descriptions in the Western press, Graceful offers precisely such a world. On board, there were mentions of a spa area, a library, a lounge with a Steinway grand piano, a gym, and an enormous indoor swimming pool of approximately 15 meters, which can, if desired, be turned into a dance floor. It is right here that the difference between simply wealthy leisure and leisure of a completely different level is especially felt. For most people, a yacht means the sea, a deck, lounge chairs, and beautiful photos at sunset. Here, everything is arranged differently. Here, the yacht must not simply be beautiful, it must create a feeling of complete autonomy. You do not go out to sea in order to take a ride. You transfer there your rhythm of life, your comfort, your privacy, and your right to be completely separate from the world. And when you hear the figure of $119 million, it becomes clear. Such yachts are not bought for route and not for speed. They are bought for the feeling that even in the middle of the sea, you are still inside a space created by your own rules. Scheherazade, the level at which the price already shocks. But if Graceful is expensive, then Scheherazade is already the kind of number at which the viewer simply stops blinking. In 2022, Reuters wrote about a yacht worth around $700 million, which the media associated with Vladimir Putin. And it is precisely here that the territory of truly heavy luxury begins, where the price tag already sounds like the value of a large corporate asset, not a private amusement. Super yachts of this level exist in a separate league altogether. This is not simply a vessel, and not simply an expensive interior. This is multi-level architecture on water. Spaces for guests, master apartments, decks for receptions, closed areas for private rest, spa, sports, a huge crew staff, and that very feeling that on board you do not have a vacation, but your own parallel reality. When in one sentence there sound the words yacht and $700 million, the human imagination already draws in everything else by itself. Marble, wood, metal, silent elevators, private lounges, guest decks, lighting that makes even the night itself part of the expensive decor. And that is exactly why such vessels always produce such a powerful effect. Not one yacht, but an entire floating world. Against this background, it is especially interesting that the conversation is not limited to the two loudest names. In open publications and investigations, other vessels also surface nearby, from relatively modest ones by the standards of super yachts to those that still amount to the budget of a luxury hotel. Olympia, Shellist, and several other yachts were named there. Yachts that in different years were linked to the closest circle or to the presidential orbit itself. Even if part of these stories remains in the zone of versions, the picture itself reads very clearly. We are speaking not about one random luxury toy, but about an entire maritime ecosystem. An armored train, when the most expensive solution looks almost ordinary. Against the background of airplanes and yachts, the train is the detail that sounds like the most unexpected turn. But the longer you look into this detail, the clearer it becomes. This is perhaps one of the most revealing things in the entire story. In 2023, the Moscow Times, citing investigations, wrote that Vladimir Putin actively uses an armored train and the special stations connected with it for personal travel. According to those publications, the interest in such a format was explained by security, by the desire not to leave too visible a digital trace, and by the convenience of closed routes. And The Independent retold reports about special stations and lines near key residences, including the areas of Novo Ogaryovo, Sochi, and Valdai. And this is a very beautiful detail, because the yacht shouts about luxury, the airplane demonstrates scale, but the train does something far more expensive. It allows one to remain unnoticed. In the luxury world, this is one of the highest levels of wealth, not to display the cost, but to hide it. After all, infrastructure that is supposed to look almost ordinary, often in reality costs more than the most spectacular external shine. According to press reports, the train is outwardly designed not to stand out too much, but inside, the conversation is about a completely different level. Closed communications, private rooms, work areas, staff, high autonomy. All of this turns the train not into a romantic journey on rails, but into a moving, closed world. A world where the road does not interrupt the usual regime, but simply transfers it from one point to another. Here, the price of the question sounds especially interesting. In open discussions, millions of dollars were mentioned for locomotives and infrastructure alone, not to mention modification of the train itself, communication systems, security, and special platforms. And that is exactly why the train turns out to be not a step backward from the airplane, but a step sideways into a subtler and perhaps even more expensive logic. Not the logic built on the wow effect, but the one built on silence. Special routes, motorcades, and a road that is cleared in advance. But even the train is only part of the overland picture, because real luxury on the ground is always measured not by a single car, but by the way the surrounding environment adjusts itself to it. And here, what the viewer usually notices only out of the corner of the eye enters the game. Motorcades, special routes, road closures, separate movement logistics. An ordinary person buys an expensive car and still stands in the general flow. At the top of the pyramid, everything works the other way around. The flow is pushed aside, and the road is cleared in advance. That is the difference between simply an expensive car and an expensive transportation infrastructure. A limousine can be bought. The right to move almost without friction with the surrounding world is a completely different level of cost. That is exactly why the presidential motorcade always looks like a separate geometry on the road. In the center, the main vehicle. Around it, escort cars, security, communications, reserve. Everything moves not simply quickly, but with such density and precision that the road for several minutes becomes private. This too is luxury, simply not in the form of chrome and leather. This is luxury in the form of access to priority. When it is not you who adapts to the city, but the city that for a short time adapts to you. And if you think about it, this is one of the most expensive forms of comfort of all that are possible. Musketeers, tasters, and life in a regime of maximum protection. When transportation of this level is gathered around one person, the next logical layer is security. And here the story becomes especially dense, because in reality, luxury of such scale does not exist without an entire ecosystem of safety. In publications about the presidential orbit, a multi-level protection system is often mentioned. Advanced teams, closed inspections of sites, reinforced routes, escort on the ground and in the air, as well as that very ring of bodyguards, which for the outsider's eye looks like simply men in suits, but in fact works like very expensive living equipment. This is no longer service and no longer protocol. This is a separate industry. Against this background, stories about tasters regularly surface, as do reports about preliminary food checks and various versions about doubles, and reports that routes and departures may confuse even observers from within the system. Somewhere this is confirmed by investigations. Somewhere it remains at the level of persistent rumors. But the general picture reads unmistakably. Around such a level of power, there forms not simply security, but a real bubble, inside which unnecessary risks are burned out in advance. In essence, what is bought here is not only equipment, but also the absence of chaos, the absence of accidents, the absence of unnecessary touches from the outside world. And the higher the stakes, the more expensive exactly this becomes. Not the seat in the cabin, but the possibility of not feeling at all the turbulence of life outside one's own perimeter. How much it costs to live as though the world was created for you. If we gather all the elements together, a very rare picture emerges. In the sky, the Il-96-300 PU, which is associated with an airborne residence. On the ground, the Aurus Senate, where even the civilian version started from 18 million rubles, while the state version goes into a much higher class. On the water, Graceful at approximately $119 million, and Scheherazade at approximately $700 million. On the rails, an armored train with its own logic, its own stations, and its own silence. And if we speak completely honestly, the main shock here does not even come from the figures. $119 million for one yacht, and not from $700 million for another. The shock is in something else, in understanding that all of this exists at the same time, not as one-time attributes of luxury, but as parallel options of one and the same life. A life where the sky, land, sea, and an entire system ready to make any route as closed and as expensive as possible are all immediately at hand. Write in the comments everything you think about this, and subscribe to the channel for the richest. Here, it is all about luxury, wealth, and the lives of the most influential people on the planet. And right now, watch the previous episodes that have already appeared on your screen.